Welcome back to the third plenary session. I hope you all had a good lunch and interesting conversations. We will now talk about, in more detail, about the critical issue that we have been touching upon this morning, namely building mass and resilience. As we have discussed this morning, the Ukraine war has demonstrated the painful realities of attrition warfare. It has also shown to us that many European forces are still understaffed and unable to meet the required readiness levels. So we are all in agreement that European nations need to grow their forces, make them more resilient and sustainable. They must also grow and maintain their equipment stockpiles, including through enhanced cooperation with the United States. And they must build more resilient forces anchored in equally resilient societies. To help us to address these core issues, we have, I think, assembled an excellent panel. And we will start with State Secretary Johan Berggren from the Swedish Ministry of Defense, who will speak about initiatives to strengthen his country's resilience based on the concept of total defense. Indeed, we can have the best equipped force, but still lose if nations are unwilling to fight and are unwilling to sustain shocks. He will then be followed by the Honorable Doug Bush, the Assistant Secretary of the US Army for Acquisition, Logistics and Technology. As we've discussed this morning, but not in sufficient detail, is that building mass is not just about people, but also about kit and innovation, and how the US Army will seek to partner with its European partners to build more sustainable NATO forces is critical. We then look forward to General Karel Raker's remarks about how the armed forces of the host nation are preparing for a new reality where Russian forces again pose a major threat to the eastern flank. And last, but certainly not least, General Vincent Giraud will provide us with the perspective from the French armed forces. Arguably, as one of Europe's most capable fighting force, France's commitment to building stronger forces for the defense of Europe together with other major European powers such as the United Kingdom and Germany is more important than ever. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. And Secretary Berggren, the floor is yours.
Dear distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for the invitation to this panel. It's a real honor and a real pleasure to be here, and particularly to be here as a new NATO member, which is a great joy for us. So I was asked to provide a Swedish perspective on our discussions about resilience, and will therefore briefly give some context to Sweden's total defense concept and our priorities as we rebuild our civil defense capabilities. So the Swedish total defense concept is composed of military and civil defense. I don't think I need to say much about military defense, but I will say a bit more about civil defense. So civil defense basically involves getting the whole of society to line up behind collective resistance. This encompasses the protection of the civilian population, obviously, ensuring the continuity of vital societal functions, and supporting, and this is very important, supporting military efforts. It includes all sectors of society: government agencies, municipalities, regions, the private sector, civil society, academia, and individuals. And sometimes in Sweden, we joke, but it's not really a joke, that if 2.5% of our GDP goes to the military, the remaining 97.5% is our civil defense, if we can effectively mobilize all of it. Now, this is not new to us. The Swedish model for total defense first emerged during World War II, and during the Cold War, Sweden invested heavily in collective resilience so as to make our neutrality credible and to deter any potential aggressors. In fact, as some of you might know, at a certain point in the 1950s, Sweden actually had the 4th largest air force in the world and could mobilize up to 800,000 men, not so many women at that point. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, Sweden, together with most Western nations, decided to downsize its military and civil defense. And actually, civil defense was basically completely disbanded. Now, the liberal democratic world order had seemingly triumphed, and in the words of historian Francis Fukuyama, we had reached the end of history. Well, as we all now know, we had not reached the end of history. And so in 2015, following the first Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Swedish government decided to reintroduce total defense planning. And today, we're taking important steps to rebuild our total defense. The government recently proposed a total defense bill outlining military and civil defense priorities for the 2025 to 2030 period. Importantly, funding for civil defense is set to increase dramatically from approximately 230 million euros in 2022 to about 730 million in 2025 and 1.3 billion in 2028. And military spending will reach 2.6% during that period. I'd like now to touch briefly on 5 key priorities as we rebuild our civil defense capabilities. Number 1, strengthening societal resilience. So to help coordinate and drive progress in civil defense, Sweden has created 10 civil preparedness sectors. And these actually, to quite a good extent, match with NATO's 7 baseline requirements. Now, 6 of these sectors have been prioritized as they are considered particularly important to ensuring societal resilience. And they're also, crucially, important to maintaining and sustaining defense efforts. And they are energy, healthcare, electronic communications, transport, food and water, and civil protection. And the majority of the new funding that I mentioned will go to these 6 sectors. This will allow for the buildup of stockpiles in important pharmaceutical and agricultural products, improved capabilities in repairing energy and transportation infrastructure, more backup generators and spare parts for mobile networks, to mention just a few highlights. We will also improve the quality of our bomb shelters and rescue services. Shelters and other protected spaces have proven crucial for Ukraine in recent years. In fact, it often means the difference between life and death and between being able to stay in your community or having to flee. And it's also proven crucial in maintaining the morale of the Ukrainian population, both at the front and in society more broadly. But shelters alone will not protect our people. Well-trained and well-resourced rescue services are essential and another key component in societal protection. With indiscriminate Russian attacks on civilian targets, including hospitals and schools, the Ukrainian rescue service have played a vital role in safeguarding Ukrainian society. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the insidious tactic of double tapping, where the Russians first attack a school or a hospital, and then a few hours later attack again when the rescue service are there, so to strike precisely at the rescue services. The lesson is clear. We need to increase the capacity of our rescue services, both quantitatively and qualitatively, and that is exactly what we're doing. Number 2, improving security of supply and involving the private sector. I don't think I need to explain to this audience the importance of supply chain security. In Sweden, we're looking in 3 broad directions to build resilience in this area. 1, creating greater production flexibility. 2, increasing stockpiling. And 3, continuing the process of de-risking. Now, production flexibility basically means having production processes that can be effectively redirected during a time of crisis. For instance, instead of producing cars for private consumption, an automaker would make vehicles necessary for wartime. Stockpiling involves the buildup of supplies in advance of a crisis to ensure the existence of an adequate supply of critical goods when supply chains become compromised. Now, this obviously entails higher costs in terms of infrastructure and the actual procurement costs, but it leaves the society much better prepared for the kinds of scenarios that we're now having to contemplate. De-risking refers to the ways in which companies and countries are diversifying supply chains by moving away from relying on a single source of supply to utilizing multiple options. Now, this obviously is a larger process that has been going on for some years, driven both by increasing geopolitical uncertainty, but also due to sustainability concerns. Now, the private sector's role in these endeavors is clearly essential. To facilitate collaboration between the private sector and government, we in Sweden have established a cross-sectoral business council for total defense and civil preparedness, crisis preparedness. The council, which brings together key government ministers, the Swedish commander-in-chief, and industry and union representatives, serves as a forum for strategic discussions and exchange of information, and is a vehicle to drive public-private partnership. The private sector, and this is particularly important, also needs to prepare itself for possible war scenarios by ensuring adequate planning and prioritization of activities. In particular, in Sweden, we're urging companies, particularly the larger ones, to put in place an organization for wartime, which requires thinking through which staff will be most important and how business activities will be maintained. The third priority is ensuring an adequate supply of human resources, both for military and civil defense. On the military side, the government has decided that 8,000 conscripts are to undergo basic military training in 2025, with a target of 10,000 by 2030. But the need for sufficient personnel also extends to civil defense. The war in Ukraine has taught us that society's most basic functions must continue to operate for a country to continue to resist in the face of an armed aggressor. We're talking about things like the supply of electricity, drinking water, the rescue services that I mentioned, schools, daycare, and so on. This is key to preserving morale and the will to resist. We are in Sweden actively looking at reintroducing civil conscription for a range of sectors to meet society's labor needs in wartime. And so just to underline, so as well as having a military conscription, we would have civil conscription at the same time to bring in youth in the civil defense areas. And we've already taken measures to reinstate conscription of civilians for rescue services and for the supply of electricity. Fourth, increasing our cybersecurity capabilities. We live in a time of increasing cyber threats and cyber attacks, requiring society to invest more resources in adequate protection. However, many companies and agencies don't focus sufficiently on cybersecurity. They sometimes lack resources, but even more problematic is a lack of management attention. Actors at all levels of society need to take responsibility for improving cybersecurity. Leaders need to prioritize these discussions in boardrooms and in management discussions. And cybersecurity perspectives need to be integrated in day-to-day operational concerns. In Sweden, we're currently developing a new national cybersecurity strategy and reforming our National Cybersecurity Center, which was established a few years ago with the aim to strengthen Sweden's ability to identify, resist, and counter cyber threats. We're investing in new cyber capabilities and will soon be adopting important new cyber security legislation from the EU, known as NIS2. I think many of you are familiar with this, which will reach more sectors of the economy and toughen requirements and sanctions. Finally, a word about the importance of our psychological defense, which might also be called the willingness to defend our country. We have seen in Ukraine that morale can beat a greater force. Psychological defense involves both resilience against propaganda, malign influence campaigns and disinformation, which we're clearly seeing today, as well as sustaining the will to resist against an armed aggressor. In Sweden, surveys consistently show that 80 to 90% of the population is ready to contribute in a civil defense capability and 40 to 50% in a military role with a weapon in hand. These are fairly good numbers, yet they need to be sustained. Without this readiness to defend our values, our democracy, and ultimately our independence, all our other efforts at building resilience may be compromised. So, to summarize and in conclusion, Sweden is on a voyage of rebuilding our civil defense. The key components include major investments in the key sectors underpinning societal resilience, mobilizing the private sector for security of supply, involving our own population through military and civilian conscription, strengthening cybersecurity, and maintaining the willingness to defend ourselves and our allies. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, State Secretary, for outlining the importance of the whole of societal approach to supporting military efforts and the comprehensive reforms that you are undertaking. And I think it will be interesting in the Q&A to deepen some of those conversations. So now we're looking forward to hearing from the Honourable Doug Bush.
So, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you here at the inaugural IISS Prague Defense Summit. I appreciate having this opportunity today to discuss the already deep ties between the United States and Europe in my area of work for the U.S. Army, specifically defense capability development and production. Let me first thank Dr. Scheer for a kind introduction and the whole team for bringing us together. And today's theme, building mass and resilience, is something I've been working on in my entire time, serving with the U.S. Army and the Pentagon. So I'm happy to bring a perspective on one element of this overall effort to build mass and resilience. And let me also thank our wonderful Czech Republic friends for their amazing hospitality this week. So as part of today's panel, I'm here to discuss one aspect of resilience. We think of resilience in the U.S. Army as comprising really three elements. One is, of course, people. As the State Secretary very eloquently put, at the end of the day, if you don't have the people with the right skill sets, you don't have anything. However, you also need weapons, munitions, supplies, depth of magazine, to use a frequently used current term. And then the third leg is training. So if you lack any of those three things, you don't have a real military capability. You have a military that might look good on paper, but absent those three things, interconnected and coordinated, you don't bring as much to the table as you need to defend your country. So I'm going to talk about ammunition, one part of that, specifically ammunition production today. So success for the United States in recent years has been dependent on strong partnerships, not only between nations, but I'll get into some very specific examples about how we are deeply tied to Europe for our defense production, but also with our defense industry partners. So really, it requires partnership across countries and with our defense companies to ensure that we actually have the capability we need, have the weapons that work, and also critically have capacity when we need it to surge for wartime. So the United States, of course, has a global military. We work in every region of the world. When we do that, however, we do take a regional approach to working with our allies and partners from a defense cooperation standpoint. But that's not just, we're not just doing that for business reasons, we're doing it for readiness reasons. So for example, here in Europe, we have suppliers across Europe that provide critical components and materials to our defense production lines and our weapon systems that U.S. Army soldiers take into battle. That dependency and interconnectedness is not a weakness, but a strength. And this administration has sought to double down on what was already a strong relationship and deepen these ties. And as I said, we do it for another reason, that's readiness. These kinds of relationships on the business side of things with supporting defense production enables us to address specific requirements in each region and more effectively support force projection, readiness and training, and most vitally, in many ways, wartime logistics capability. In an enduring conflict or a long-scale conflict, it can become ultimately an economic competition. If we don't have these ties built with our allies in our key regions of the world where we have allies to work with, we can't create them from scratch. We have to have them in advance, and that's one of the underpinnings of why the United States has emphasized defense cooperation with foreign defense companies. So let me highlight a few that I'm personally very familiar with where we are already extremely interdependent with Europe on our production needs. One example is actually TNT, the key explosive we use to fill our artillery shells. For many years, Europe, one country in Europe was our only source for TNT. And we have procured a lot, I can tell you, since this conflict started. But it's great to see already other allies investing in capability to produce explosives. But without that European partnership, we would not be able to be on the ramp we're on artillery production, which I'll get into briefly later. Another area is a very specific grades of nitrocellulose. So this is one of the elements of propellant that is used to project shells from weapon systems to actually do their job. There are several sources in Europe that are still the best in the world, the highest quality, best cost, or lowest cost that we rely on as part of our overall munitions production efforts. Another one, and by the way, these chemical technical terms, I'm a political scientist by background. I've had to learn all these chemistry terms, so please, if there's any chemists in the audience and I mess one up, please be kind. Nitroguanidine, a word I didn't even know existed until I got this job. But nitroguanidine is a vital element of what's called triple-base propellant, which is how you get the kind of extended ranges for munitions necessary. Our source for that remains today one country in Europe, a great ally, who has provided us with that production and is expanding that production on their own. We are also going to start producing that in the United States over time, but we still rely on our partner here to help us to enable our production. A couple more examples. The United States Army actually chose a recent new shoulder-fired munition that is, for the first few years of the program, going to be made here in Europe and shipped to the United States and issued to our forces. Now, over time, we're going to transition that to being produced in the United States, but here's one where we are buying a finished product and a full-up weapon from a European ally and equipping American forces directly with it. And there are many other examples. And a final one I'd mention is helicopter production. So the U.S. Army, we have the most helicopters in the U.S. military. Of course, we have about 5,000 or 6,000. Well, we are producing them in quantity still. We could not do that without our European allies. There are 20 companies across 8 different countries in Europe who provide upwards of 1,500 parts that are vital to all of our helicopter production. So here again, we are already deeply connected, and these companies we source from are the best in the world for these products, and we rely on them. So while it's a critical topic of this panel and actually this entire conference is where we can do more in defense cooperation, I think it's really important to recognize that we are already deeply interconnected. And that's because we have talented companies in our countries who are really good at making certain things. The United States benefits greatly today from this deep interconnectedness, and I hope it continues in the future. So let me also talk briefly in terms of what we've learned since the war in Ukraine started regarding our own resilience and how we've looked at needing to reform ourselves. So we are, one example, $4 billion into an industrial capacity investment in artillery ammunition production. I would like to highlight that investment has been extremely bipartisan with our U.S. Congress. So in our system, the executive branch doesn't actually have any money. The Congress has to provide it all. We have worked with Congress in a very bipartisan way because many members across both parties saw this as just a good generational investment in American production capability. It's about more than Ukraine. It's about providing this capacity for the long term to improve our deterrence. So that $4 billion investment is playing out now. We are now up to 40,000 155 shells a month. We're going to get to 55,000 a month in December, and we have a path to 100,000 a month in 2025. Those contracts are already in place. Equipment's being procured, concrete's being poured, factories are being built. So that is already happening. There are some other areas. We are going to double our production for our new M1147 armored multi-purpose round. This is a new multi-purpose round for the M1 tank. Again, Congress worked with us to double the production capacity of that and make investments. We are $1.1 billion into investments into our new small caliber round, the 6.8 millimeter round for our new rifle and automatic rifle that will equip a good portion of the U.S. Army. But we are creating a from-scratch production capacity for that. Other areas, we've spent $136 million to triple production of Stinger missiles, $354 million to double production of Javelin missiles, $755 million just put on contract to further increase production of Patriot PAC-3 missiles, $361 million to move guided multiple launch rocket system production to 14,000 a year. And finally, several hundred million to modernize our ability to produce cannon and artillery gun tubes in the United States. Europe has great capability in those areas, but this is our investment in our industrial base to make sure we are good partners. And I can mention one more because it's more recent. The conflict in the Middle East has led us to make similar investments in counter unmanned aircraft system defense. So working with one of our industry partners, we have now got in place a plan to move up to producing 100 a month of Coyote interceptors, one of the most effective interceptor systems we've had for counter-UAS in combat in the Middle East. So this is a trend that's continuing. And again, it's been very bipartisan. So if I could close by offering two areas that I think there is room for growth where we can do more with Europe working together, two new technology areas. One is unmanned systems. And when I say that broadly, uncrewed systems, drones, whatever term you want to use, this is both in the air and on the ground. Ukraine has shown the power of these systems, the potential they have, the drone war in Ukraine and the related counter-drone war. The U.S. Army is trying to draw all the lessons we can from that. But we know that a lot of very capable companies exist here in Europe and with our partners around the world, but particularly here in Europe, with a lot to offer in this area. We want to partner with your companies with advanced technology to both produce, develop advanced capabilities for unmanned systems, but also work with us on the counter-unmanned systems technology necessary to protect our forces. The last one I'd mention in this same general theme is in a little more detail, counter-UAS systems. So what we found is working best is a layered system. It starts with simple things like proximity-fused ammunition from medium caliber cannon systems, then moves up to advanced interceptors as some of the ones I've mentioned, but also critically an area for great potential is directed energy, both lasers and high-powered microwaves that we see complementing our kinetic systems in a more affordable way to down these cheap drones. It makes no sense to shoot a Shahed drone down with a Patriot missile. That cost trade-off is about as bad as it gets. Although my Navy colleagues, their missiles are more expensive than mine, so actually I'm ahead of them. But we are working with the Navy very closely, by the way. They're doing terrific work in the Red Sea, defending our allies and ourselves. But we have to find a way to get on the right side of the cost curve, and we want to work with you to do that. We have to find technologies that make it affordable and efficient to counter mass unmanned systems. The technology's there, and I think working together, this is an area for great potential growth moving forward. So thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions, and thank all of you in the room. I think it's quite a few folks who have worked with this administration I represent so well over the last 4 years to accomplish so much, not just to support Ukraine, but to support all of our collective defense and making us more resilient and more able to withstand the forces the State Secretary spoke about for an enduring period. Our relationship with Europe is not 4 years at a time. It is enduring. So that won't change. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and very, encouraging to hear that you think that the excellent cooperation that you outlined will continue under the next administration. So thank you so much. Now we turn to General Reka to talk about the Czech Armed Forces.
All right, so first, let me also thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor. I will be maybe more general, not by rank, but more general in my speech, but obviously there will be a chance to answer the questions. So why is mass and resilience so important for us as a military now? It's because we get a new task in. Our national defense strategy and national security strategy tells us, my military tells, that we need to be preparing for the large-scale, high-intensity armed conflict with technologically advanced adversary who possess nuclear weapons. That's a tasking. That's very, very different from what we had before. Actually, the previous tasking was not to prepare for such a conflict because it's too expensive, there will be enough warning time, and so on. And that's a completely different problem. And that requires a change of mindset. Not only in military, I think that's going to be easier, but that requires change of mindset in the whole society. So the other thing which you need to have if you want to fight this type of conflict is you need the whole of government and whole of society approach. And I think that's because we were not doing this and preparing for this. This is really, I think, the hardest task for us to learn now. And we are learning and relearning how to do this. The support from the society and its resilience is crucial if we want to be successful in this large-scale potential crisis. And obviously, we also need to be able to connect all the instruments of power. What is also important is that these efforts must be long-term and consistent. And we are again and again and again failing in this. So we always wait for the crisis and then we start doing something, and that's too late. And we see it now for our military, it's a huge problem now with the manpower, with the resources, even though my government is great and they went to 2% of GDP, because for the last 18 years we were so heavily under-resourced. That's not enough, and it takes years and years to get ready. Not only for the new tasking we get in from collective defense plans, from NATO and the new capability targets we're going to receive, but even for the old ones. And that's the result of not being continuously preparing and constantly keeping the effort and resources. Our societies are under the pressure from different actors. We've got this hybrid warfare campaign in Europe that's very obvious from Russia. And why that's concerning is because all the defense is about will. It's about will to defend and will to fight. And that's exactly when they are targeting us. They're targeting the society to weaken the will, undermine the unity, and spread the fear, and also distrust of the people towards the institutions. Why? I don't want to go to details in hybrid, but the reason I'm mentioning it is because most of the hybrid threats and hybrid problems are outside of military domain. But our plans, won't be executable if that doesn't work. Whether it's ICT, whether it's critical infrastructure, whether it's the will of society, whether it's political institutions and their working, we are dependent on those civilian out of military domains. And if that fail, we fail too as a military. So, and it comes back to basically relearning how to work all together. And if we talk about, for example, how we prepare ourselves as a military, it's not only about protecting critical infrastructure or protecting military facilities. You cannot do this without other aspects, like, for example, free movement of spies and diplomats from those countries which are threatening us. It's about issuance of new diplomatic and short-term visas, offering citizenships, lack of state control over the real estate or security of supply chain, vulnerabilities and strategic dependencies we are building in telecommunications, for example. And all these things are so important for the military, because if that is not covered, our plans won't be executable. That's why I'm mentioning it, because we as a military cannot really deal with this, but it's important that we talk about it and then we advise this and we say it aloud. Talking about the mass, what the Ukrainian shows us now, or maybe reminds us, because this is a constant fact, is that mass is still a relevant actor in the warfare. Any operational capacity of the military is a combination of quality and quantity. And also attrition matters. The countries like Czech Republic will never, we cannot have strategy based on attrition or large numbers, because we don't have these resources. However, it is still a factor, even for us. So it's about reserves, it's about stockpiles, and it's about other systems, which, again, we forgot to build, and we forgot the importance. Attrition became like a rude word. It's not actually. It's a relevant factor, and we need to be preparing for this. And yes, there's a number of lessons from Ukrainian battlefield, which we can discuss during these questions about, concentrating effects without concentrating mass, no safe rear area, challenges for example, camouflage with a number of sensors in the air, importance of deception and things like that. But talking about technology is one thing, but second thing, what I see really as the biggest challenge for our military right now is the people. It's the personnel. And not only about personnel as a professional military part, but also the reserves and the willingness of the regular citizens to fight and protect the country. And we, about nearly 20 years ago, we canceled conscription, and it was the right thing to do at the time, because, there was a lot of negative feeling about it. It was still linked to the old Soviet-type conscription and army. So I think it was necessary. However, it was also very popular politically, and we did it, but no one was thinking about generating reserves, for example. So we are now discovering and experimenting with different systems, how to generate enough reserves. And also, it came with a narrative. And the narrative which was sold to our citizens was that, okay, well, we'll invest into this small professional military. I think they had 4M. It was like Mala, which is small, mobile, and whatever. And the narrative was, okay, we're going to invest into this professional small military, and they will do everything for you, and that's okay, and it's the right way to do it. Actually, without saying people, yeah, but you still have a role. Each of you have a role in the defense. And if the large-scale crisis comes, it's not about what state is doing for you, it's not about what military does for you, but actually each of you must participate. And this is very unpopular to remind it now to the people. But I think that's one of the big challenges we need to do. Also, what changed is that we're not planning our capabilities now based on ambitions, as we did before. Not in NATO, but also not nationally. So before, we had a set of political military ambitions, and everything was planned for that. Now, we are planning on threat. So regardless what your ambitions are, there is a threat, and if you want to be able to cope with a threat, you need to adjust your ambitions and your capabilities to the threat. That sounds logical, but it's completely new because it wasn't done like this, before. Not even in NATO, with the NATO defense planning process, it's more focusing now on threat than before, but definitely not nationally here. And we had a set of ambitions before, which we were preparing for, but now actually, it's a huge change for the military. Right now, if we go to collective defense scenario in NATO, the whole military, the whole Czech military plays the role and is somehow involved. So basically what would happen is that whatever is not necessary for territorial defense, protecting our infrastructure, doing a host nation support, and making sure that, that we work properly as a sending, receiving, and transit country, everything else will be deployed somewhere and available to the fight. And again, that's a completely different mindset. It's a different challenges about manpower, about stockpiles, about reserves, about system of fast mobilization, and so on. And these are the things which we didn't do for last 20 years. So I would probably end here, and I'll be ready to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for outlining all these major challenges ahead of us. I mean, as I was listening to you, the list got longer and longer, and we'll probably, in the Q&A, dive more deeply into this. So now, last but not least, General Giroux.
Bien, bonjour à tous, mesdames et messieurs les ministres, messieurs les officiers généraux. Be reassured I won't speak French too long. I'm not sure I will understand myself, so I try to do that in English. France has just completed a 20-year period of expeditionary operations, which were marked by the fact that it was far away from our land, sometimes not far away from our overseas territories, but far away from what we call the hexagon. It was quite frugal in equipment needed to fight. And finally, I say those fights were chosen. They were not imposed to ourselves. We were deciding to go there. And that is probably the most important change we are currently witnessing. And this is very interesting to see that the very day of the 35th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, we are the 9th of November, we are coming back to something which was the key of the Cold War, which were mass and resilience. And that is very interesting to witness that type of comeback. That comeback hasn't been forgotten by France, because we have continuously worked on those subjects, even if we were dragged to operation, counterterrorism operation in Africa, but also in Iraq and in the Middle East, where we are still present. And we will continue to be present there differently, but we will continue to be present because terrorism isn't over. Today, we have new crises, but terrorism is not over. And so we will have to continue to do what we have been doing for 20 years. And in the meantime, we will have to think in mass and resilience. So mass and resilience are key success factors, and mass is the key success factor for resilience. Why? Because first of all, it provides the right strength ratio. I'd say that is a Jominian way of fighting. The number of people or the number of equipment you put in the field are the solution of the military equation. Obviously, it is still worthwhile to have that importance of the strength ratio in the field. It's exactly what we are currently witnessing in Ukraine. And one of the important factors of that strength ratio, and has been said several times, are human resources. And that is key in Western countries where people are probably more eager to go in the battlefield than previously. Today, in French armed forces, we aren't in difficulty because of recruitment. We still continue to recruit. The French MOD recruits every year 26,000 people, and we are still successful to do that. What is at stake is how we retain people when they join our ranks. And many things have been done for that. It has been successful this year. And we are not aiming only at people, but also we are aiming at their environment, especially at their families, because we know that there is pressure on the families, and if we want to continue to retain and to have the sufficient number of fighters, we need also to take care of their families. The second thing that brings mass for resilience is obviously, and it has been also mentioned, the ability to last and to be sustainable. And one of the key success factors to last are stockpiles. It has been mentioned. We are currently working both by putting money on the table. For the next 7 years, France will dedicate 16 billion euros to purchase ammunition. But to purchase ammunition, you have to have corporates able to produce ammunition. And that is the second factor, not only money, but also the corporation, which are ready to do that, and has been also raised. Therefore, one of the things which have been put in the law, we have a law which covers the military programming from 2024 up to 2030. Within the law, there is an article where the government forces the corporation to have a certain level of stockpiles on their own, for raw material, for some equipment, and the government is allowed to requisite those corporations and to force them to have a certain level of stockpile. So that is probably what we are expecting from having mass. But mass, to be resilient, has also to be consistent. And consistency is also a key success factor to regroup mass and resilience. Mass has to be consistent with technology. Technology is today probably the way to leverage our weapons with artificial intelligence, with drone, with EW, and obviously with laser and technologies which are arriving in the field. That's one of the reasons why within the law I just described, we are investing a lot in artificial intelligence, especially the French MOD is currently purchasing its own supercalculator to be independent, so that our corporation will be able to use it with our data, which are also one of the key success factors for AI. So, but we are purchasing our own supercalculator so that we are getting to be independent, and it will arrive next year. The consistency with technology, also with the right balance of forces. Having fighter is very important, obviously, but having the proper command and control system is also paramount. The right enablers, air defense, engineers, all those equipment which sometimes lack in our inventories. That's one of the reasons why French army recreated one brigade, artillery brigade, and one engineer brigade, even if the French armed forces still had Indian regiments, but it had been decided to recreate brigades to act as enablers at division and corps level. Maintenance, logistic support, combat CSS is also key. When you are fighting abroad with a small number of forces, it's always, I'd say, easy to forget the subject of maintenance and logistics. So today we are investing in buying an increasing number of stockpile of spare parts. You have never enough spare parts, but I come back to the law I just described. Even in that sector, the government is allowed to force corporations to have a certain level of stockpile. But to be consistent with a balance of force, you have also to be consistent with the plan and to be realistic. What can I really do with the forces I have, and not to write a letter to Santa Claus. The purpose is really to say what I am really able to do with the forces I have. We don't have to lie to each other. We have to say the truth with what we have. And when you say the truth, it's always better to be able to face your adversary. I think that is one of the keys of the balance of forces, having the realistic planning. Finally, mass has to be consistent with also multi-domain operations. Obviously, we all know the importance of cyber. France is going to invest 4.6 billion euros in that law for cyber. Info operation, we are getting increasingly interested in cognitive warfare, which is probably one of the sectors where we will have to move. And obviously space. France had a strategy in 2019, and now we have Space Common, which was put in Toulouse in 2021. And we work with a lot of nations which are here. But behind mass and resilience, and it has also been mentioned, something which is probably more important is the fighting spirit. The fighting spirit of your nation and the fighting spirit of your forces. The fighting spirit of the nation is paramount. Obviously, the presence of the military within the society decreased with the end of conscription, which was decided in 1996 in France. But in France, we always kept one day in the year during which every youngster has to come and to receive not a training, but an information about the geostrategic environment and how you can join the military. Roughly between 700 and 800 youngsters have to do that day every year, and they need to have that day done. Otherwise, they can't enter. They can't have their driving license. They can't enter the administration and so on. So we will continue, and we will in the next month we will militarize that day, because we think it's very important to have a fighting spirit nation, and and for the forces it's the same, and to have that, the training is the key. The training is the key, based on lessons learned, on combat experience, and it is very important to have a combat-proven units so that they are able to transmit their experience to new generation, because we all know that to build effective armed forces, you have to be layers on layers, and we are all the product of the layers of centuries of military experience. You can't create that at once, and the combat experience is key, and the training is key within the training to raise especially our officers to maneuver, to be agile, and first of all to think the enemy, not their own maneuver, but to start with the enemy. It sounds truism, but sometimes it's very interesting. You have your very nice maneuver, but you don't take into account the enemy, and at the end of the day you are defeated because you have prepared your own maneuver, and that's all. So to conclude, I said in introduction that mass and resilience come back. But let's remember that during Cold War, there was something very important too, which was a mass and resilience equalizer, which is called nuclear deterrence. And that subject is obviously directly linked to mass and resilience. That's the reason why working on mass and resilience are key for us, and we are working to get better on that. But obviously, the key of the defense architecture relies on nuclear deterrence. That's the reason why France has launched a program of the renewal of his two components, his submarines as well as his ballistic missiles, and also for the air component, especially the air missiles. So, yeah, in French, we say that sometimes history repeats. I won't say that, obviously not, but it resembles a lot. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, General, for reminding us that we are almost back to the Cold War, and that mass and resilience are back on the agenda, but also linking it to nuclear deterrence, which I think was quite interesting. We now have roughly 40 minutes for Q&A, and there's a lot of questions now coming in. And I first give the floor to Stefan Löwenstein. The mic is live.
Thank you. I would just jump to the last speaker, reminding us of the significance of nuclear deterrence. In the light of the new political situation in the US, would you, I asked the panelists whether you consider it granted that the US nuclear umbrella will secure Europe in future, or whether we would depend on the European nuclear deterrence provided inside the EU only by France. Thank you.
And next on my list, Marcin Terlikowski.
Good morning. Actually, very similar question to the one just asked, but very simply, is there a work in French General Staff on how the French nuclear doctrine can be amended in the light of the challenge from Russia and the potential, let's say, transatlantic tension and the European factor of the, or European dimension of the French nuclear policy could be augmented to involve some new, more concrete vehicles to reach out to allies and reinforce the usual lines which have been taken by all French presidents since the end of the Cold War. So is there any significant change in the doctrine and the policy of nuclear deterrence France, at least considered in Paris? Thank you.
That escalated rather quickly. One more question, Tom Beckett.
Thank you. We often present the challenge between the West and four rogue nations, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, none of which are known particularly for husbanding their manpower when it comes to war fighting. They're quite willing to apply mass with large casualties. When we look at Assistant Secretary of the Army Bush talked about manpower, equipment, training, and sustainability. And just giving some examples on the equipment side, when the British Army announced the introduction of the Challenger 3, the upgrade from Challenger 2 to Challenger 3, it said it would be one of the most potent main battle tanks on the battlefield. And then some wag said, yes, but also one of the most scarce. So there's a mass problem with equipment in Europe, and I include the UK in Europe. We also have huge trouble in Europe to recruit, whether it's because people don't want to join, whether because their parents are serving as a blocker, whether because the incentives are too low. Is it time in Europe, notwithstanding America, because I think America's never forgotten what mass means, is it time for Europe more commonly to appreciate the value of conscription?
Good. With this round of easy questions, maybe we go in the order that maybe General Giroux, do you want to address these easy questions about French nuclear deterrence? Maybe General Raker, you talk a little bit about the recruitment retention challenge. Maybe Assistant Secretary, if you want to address sort of Tom's question about what you might see as some, are we generating enough equipment? And I want to sneak in a little question also for the State Secretary, because you mentioned, that only in 2014 did Sweden, rediscover the concept of total defense. And then you said we are on the voyage. I think that was the term you used. Where on the voyage are you in implementing all these really interesting, comprehensive areas that you outlined? So maybe, General Giroux, you want to start?
Yes, thank you very much for these easy questions. I'd say for the time being, there is no deep changes in the French doctrine. It's only a reminder which has been made by President Macron, which dates 30 years ago with his predecessors, who say that French doctrine is based upon ambiguity and what we call vital interest. And there is no list of vital interest, fortunately. One French president, when he's replaced, doesn't give a list of vital interest to his successor and to say, okay, if you try to strike the Eiffel Tower, you will receive a nuclear bomb from France. It's not the way it's done, because it is based upon ambiguity. But it has always been said by French policymakers that European vital interests are in the sphere and in the mind of the French. And if our allies are threatened, there is no reason that we are not threatened. And mechanically, there is a European dimension of French deterrence in that way. That doesn't change the doctrine. It recalls what is our doctrine from the very beginning. And it's directly linked with what I said at the beginning. Vital interests are voluntarily ambiguous, and we know that the people we are threatening with our nuclear deterrence are masters of ambiguity. And collectively, and probably I can open on that subject, I think that we have transparent societies, probably very transparent societies, and our competitors are not transparent. So how far do we go in transparency, in our strategic goals, and how transparent are we in the way we are explaining our plans to the rest of the world?
Thank you. General.
Yeah, it was a recruitment, retention. There was a question about whether it's time to reintroduce conscription. I guess it depends on every particular country. I think it's all about sense of urgency within this society. So you can look at the nations like the Nordic countries or Baltic countries or Poland, where it's probably easier to propose such things because of the sense of urgency, because people understand the reality of the threat. Here in Czech Republic, I think in order to reintroduce conscription, you need some kind of consensus in the society, which is not here. So I think it's not realistic right now. And I think what we need really is to be honest to the people and educating society and explaining the threats and the reality. That's very difficult politically. It takes a lot of courage from the politicians. But if I put it very plainly as a military without any politics, our current personnel model doesn't work. It will have to change somehow. It just doesn't work. With all the figures, all the predictions, we're not able to achieve our designated targets. The requirements will grow with the new capability targets, with the new round of defense planning process. So there will have to be change. It doesn't have to be massive conscription. It can be, there are different models, but something will have to change. Where I see the problem is that the only people talking about it are military. that needs to be heard from the political leaders, and we need to educate our society. That's what I see as a problem in my country.
Thank you.
Sure, so let me actually, I'll help my colleague at the end on the nuclear question. My administration, it's actually been an area, another one of bipartisan consensus is renewal and improvement of the United States' nuclear arsenal. So we have active programs underway to replace all three legs of the triad. That has been very bipartisan with strong support from Congress. So I think that American commitment, certainly this administration's policy has been to ensure we have that capability, including not just for ourselves, but for our allies. On the area of munitions production, the reason I rattled off all those numbers about what the United States is doing is that reflects a political choice. So yes, we have the capability. We have in this room probably every advanced economy in the world is almost every single one is represented here. We have amazingly talented people. We have remarkably talented companies. If there is political will over a sustained period and resources are committed, yes, of course, we can build resilience in terms of having more munitions on hand as deterrence, but also an ability to surge if we have to for an extended conflict. So the United States made that choice in a bipartisan way. We are in the middle of that surge. European countries have also done a lot. It's not just us. It is great to see. I hope those things continue. But fundamentally, it is a political choice, and you have to get the people of your country to support providing those resources. There are other things we could spend money on. But America came together actually in a very joint way when the war in Ukraine started to make this generational investment in munitions production capability. So I think, yes, absolutely, European countries and the United States, of course we can do it. We just have to decide to and commit the money and stick with it, because it doesn't happen quickly.
Just a very quick follow-up. Could you give some assurance on the Europeans in this room that also under the next US administration, the commitment to nuclear extended deterrence remains as it is?
So I'm not touching that. So first of all, it would be inappropriate of me to do so. New administration, we have one president at a time. New administration will come in, they will make their assessment, they will staff their team. They will make that judgment and advise the president on any of those issues. I just will observe that over Republican and Democratic administrations over really even since the end of the Cold War, that commitment to maintain a nuclear deterrence hasn't wavered. That said, I don't speak for the new administration, and when they come in, I encourage leaders across Europe and the world to engage in that conversation. It's a very important one, but that will be for the new president and his team to decide.
Johan.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. You know, you can always see the glass half full or half empty. I'll try to do a little bit of both in the vein of intellectual honesty. I mean, look, on the positive side, there's huge engagement in society generally about the concept of rebuilding the concept of total defense. You know, when I have the pleasure of visiting Parliament, I will get questions about why we're not spending more money on civil defense from certain parties. So there's a great drive for building civil defense. We have this system in place. We kind of joke sometimes that when Swedes go abroad, we always say we have a system. Well, we have a system for civil defense. We have these 10 sectors. We have I didn't mention, we have 65,000 bomb shelters, which is more than many countries in Europe. Now, they're not all in a perfect state, but a lot of the filters need to be replaced to be able to deal with CBRN attacks. But the vast, vast majority of them are certainly capable of dealing with conventional attacks. So you have that basic robustness for 70% of the population. I mentioned the figure, 80 to 90% are willing to fight to defend the country either with weapon in hand or in a civil role. That's a very, very good number, which we need to build to maintain. We are in the process of building up stockpiles, but we have a while to go. And then maybe I transition over to what's the glass half empty. We have a while to go on security of supply. It's very expensive to build the kind of stockpiles that we had during the Cold War. Finland, I think we have a couple of Finnish friends in the room. We often talk about Finland as sort of the gold standard on civil and total defense, because Finland, perhaps the lone country in Western Europe, chose not to disarm militarily or in a civil capacity. And they have maintained, for example, a system of stockpiling. if Sweden were to have the same level of ambition, it would be a cost of about 4 to 5 billion euros, and for France it would be 6 times that. So it's a lot of money if you're going to rebuild at that level. But we don't necessarily need to rebuild in exactly the same way, and that's why it's important to look at the flexibility of contracts and have flexible approaches, and looking at more modern approaches. The whole point here, of course, is we're not doing a copy paste of the Cold War system, because the world is very different with globalization and the EU and new technologies. So we need to be smart about what we change. Cyber, I think, I have to admit, is an area where we have a lot of work to do, and we are trying to move, but it takes a bit of time. So a lot of good progress, a lot of good vectors, but some work to do.
Great, thank you. Next round of questions, we start with Esther Sabatino.
Thank you. I would like to go back to the stockpiling question. So France, as far as I know, is at the moment the only country in Europe that has a system that allows that forces industry, as we were told, to prioritize certain orders. And if they do not do it, then they are supposed also to pay some fines. And I wonder if this mechanism has been received positively in the country. Another question for the other people on the panel will be if that could be possible to have a similar system in their respective countries. And then during the conversation, there was a lot of focus on trying to find the right money and long-term and persistent investments. And I wonder if in creating stockpilings, cooperation could be a way to do that. And if yes, who should do that, and on which kind of equipment or capabilities? Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. And Bastian.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thanks to the speakers. The question I have was prompted by something that General Giraud said in his remarks, but it's addressed to the whole panel. And it goes back to that idea of a balanced force and what that might mean. I mean, 2-3 years ago, we would have probably said that defense establishments, armed forces that have come out of basically 2 decades of cuts will just, by definition, find it very hard to grow again. That, because you need to. So that paradigm shift seems to have happened, based on what most of you have said. But what I expected to hear a bit more about is when we talk about mass and resilience, to also talk about preparing for attrition, which is kind of like a logical afterthought. We talked about stockpiles, which relates to high use rates, but there's also that question of attrition and how that might influence that connection between mass resilience and technology that you spoke about. And I was just wondering whether the speakers have thoughts on the direction that those debates might go, might take in their respective countries. Are we prepared for that reality? In which ways are we going to use technology to mitigate that reality? And how does that affect your ability to generate mass and resilience? Thank you.
Thank you. And last on my list for this round is James Hackett. James, the micro is live.
Thanks, Ben. Just picking up on the point that General Recker was talking about on educating society on defence, and he was talking about the need to do that in the Czech Republic. But the question is directed to State Secretary Berggren. What lessons can you offer in how to educate and motivate the citizenry apart from conscription? What are you doing in the sort of education space, for instance, from early years onwards to inculcate that sort of popular resilience? And then picking up another, and again it's to you, picking up the thread of cognitive defense and psychological defense. How are you looking to build that as well? Build that resilience within society? And what's the nature of the threat that you see at the moment in that area? Thanks.
Thank you. So maybe we start with the two generals. Maybe if you want to address the easy question about whether we are prepared for attrition. Then turning to you, Secretary Bush, maybe talking a little bit about that question, how do we build long-term persistent stockpiles and how can we cooperate more, and then back to the State Secretary. Who of you would want to go?
Okay, are we ready? Not. No, we're not ready, I think. We are thinking about the future warfare for us is that we will always try to go for to have the technological edge over the enemy because of our relatively small size and resources. And we'll try to fight in a way to be able to concentrate the effects of combat power without necessarily concentrating the huge mass of forces and people to preserve the people. The challenge with the equipment is, and one of the lessons we take in is that it will be more important maybe we're more looking at the security of supplies for the equipment. Also, even if it's a complicated system which we're not able to produce in Czech Republic, we always try to employ the Czech companies to help the defense industry to grow, and also to be able to do the maintenance and repairs here in the country. So that's much more emphasis on it than before. That's the equipment. Also, one of the more important things is that we should more and more strive for open architecture solutions instead of buying black boxes like before, because we see that we have to adapt much faster on the battlefield. And for the people, I think we need to have an effective mobilization system, because at some point we'll have to mobilize people. Even though it's very unpopular, when I say this aloud, I'm getting immediately huge criticism from political leaders, some of them. Usually it's the narrative about military shouldn't talk about this, it's a political, blah, blah, blah. But actually, it's a tough truth. So for us, the only way how to cope with the attrition on the human side is to have a good mobilization system.
Yeah, as for the first question of attrition and the level of acceptance of people being killed, I think that is the subject. For us, not at the same level as the US, but as many European armed forces, we have been at war. Not at huge war, so I'd say Clausewitzian small wars, but we have been at war, and we have sustained casualties. Every day, in the French armed forces, there have been military killed since the Algerian war every year. And it continues because we are still present, and the level of acceptance of the French society is still quite high and quite good, because we only speak about professional soldiers. And the point is that when do you reach a point where you have to retake normal citizens to be at arms? And today, I haven't the answer. The sole answer I have is that today, conscription in France is not cancelled, it's only suspended. In 1996, it has been suspended. It hasn't been cancelled. That is to say, the law still exists. It's only a decision to be taken, but the law exists. I would like to just rebound to the question concerning the mass with the US forces. I would be very interested if we could do the ratio between the population and the number of people in arms. If we regroup the entire European population and the entire armed forces, I'm not sure that we are that different. We are not as coherent, as consistent, that's sure, but the ratio, I'm not sure it is that easy. But it would be very interesting to do that. But yeah, attrition, today I couldn't answer. where I could answer is that the attrition, and you mentioned it, we have to find the right equipment as a leverage for attrition. And I come back to, I fully agree with what you say. One of our problems is that our corporation, our industries, with very clever, scientific, try to make something very technological, long cycle, very, very difficult to sustain, and whereas today we will have attrition of equipment. And if you need attrition of equipment, it's exactly what you say at the last panel. You have to buy on shelves. And where do you find on shelf? It's commercial. And probably what you buy is not exactly what you are expecting, which you don't have all the specification, but you know that you will have at once something you need, which is approximately what you need, and which will be able to be attrited.
Sure, so I can't really add to my esteemed military colleagues on the subject of attrition, but I can just tell you that the U.S. Army's version of attrition is in one direction, against the enemy. So the U.S. Army's history is one of substituting firepower in order to protect our soldiers. That's how we've always gone to war. That won't change. So I think we value our soldiers' lives, as do all of our European allies. We have to find a way to work together to ensure that our potential enemies know that while our forces may be not large in numbers of people, they will be vast and overwhelming in their military effectiveness, even in conventional conflict. To create deterrence, we need to ensure our enemies don't do the wrong thing. So to shorten it, yeah, attrition's great as long as you're the one doing it. So in terms of stockpiles, so the United States, we do have a stockpiling system. At the strategic level, the U.S. government does maintain critical stockpiles of materials. This administration, one of the initiatives has been to expand and improve those in new areas such as rare earths, other critical materials that you need to make advanced electronics in particular. So we need to collectively rethink, and we've been working on that. And to be fair, it actually started with previous administration before we arrived because of the COVID situation, to think and expand about what those stockpiles need to be. We don't need, as the State Secretary said very well, to just replay the Cold War, but new equipment and new types of technology need new stockpiles behind them to have sufficient supplies. And of course, the best kind of stockpile to have is large weapons magazines, to buy you time to ramp up your defense industry. That's always been our model for mobilization. We drifted away from that. We have learned that lesson, I think, in a bipartisan way, and I think we are committed to building those stockpiles over time to ensure we have sufficient deterrence, not just to protect ourselves, but our allies as well.
Thank you. State Secretary.
Thank you. Two great questions. One about sort of how we educate society, and the second one, as I understood it, a little bit more about cognitive defense. So in terms of educating the society, I think one has to obviously here understand that every country is different. We all have our own histories and our geographies, and our particular history and geography is one that I think very much, there's no naivety about what's going on further east, if we put it that way. The Swedish population has its history and its geography, and so we see what's going on in Ukraine, we see what's going on in Russia, and people, we don't need to educate hugely, to put it bluntly. People see and learn and draw their conclusions. However, in education, we do actively try to talk about civil defense and total defense, and actually it's becoming part of the curriculum at high school and may become part of the curriculum at the lower grades. And so, for example, I've seen already now that 10-year-olds in Sweden sometimes, as a school exercise, get to sort of prioritize which 10, on a list of 10 things, which are the most important to be able to sustain yourself in a crisis, right? It can be a non-antagonistic crisis as well, right? So, I mean, that's a good exercise to teach young people about how to think about these things. We also, I said we have a system, well, we have a brochure, and we have a brochure that we send out to all households, and a new version of that brochure is coming out in a few weeks, and it's called If War or Crisis Comes, and it goes through, the threats, from cyber to non-antagonistic threats, including war, and it talks about what the population can do to prepare itself. It has checklists of food and materials. It talks about the willingness to defend. It talks about psychological risks, and it actually talks about nuclear attacks. Again, this new brochure will talk about the risks of nuclear attacks and how a population should start preparing for that. It doesn't have 10 pages on that, but it has, 1 page on that. And I think most of our countries had that during the Cold War, and we now think it's time to start thinking about that again. Some people will say, are you being alarmist? Well, I'd say we're being realistic, and it's better to prepare. In terms of your second question about cognitive issues, I didn't mention, but we have an agency for psychological defense, which you may be aware of, which actually looks at how we help prepare the population and defend ourselves against propaganda and disinformation. Here, I think most so-called, most people who look at these maybe from a more academic point of view would also say that the concept of media literacy is very important to train our populations also from a young age to be source critical when we read papers, when we act online, to not spread sources that we're not sure where they come from, to think critically about these things. And I think also in the Swedish case, and perhaps in Northern Europe and most countries in Europe, hopefully, there's a lot of trust in institutions. We have a strong social contract. And so it's relatively easy to have a fairly open and honest discussion with the population about the threats and how we should act together. But it needs to be maintained. We can't take anything for granted in this day and age.
Thank you. That leaves me with a little story that I wanted to tell, because my family lives in Stockholm, and recently on a nice Sunday afternoon I was cycling through a park, and I turned to my left and there are these armed forces, Swedish armed forces, training in the park. And I almost, with my Germanic upbringing, I almost fell off my bike. But all these Swedes were just jogging around, having their dogs on the leash, while this regiment was exercising in a public park. And so the difference in sort of, in the mental mindset of the Swedish population is quite different to what other countries in Europe are facing. We have 7 minutes left, and I have Lucy Béraud-Sudreau on our list. Lucy.
Thank you. Staying in Sweden, I have a question for State Secretary Johan Berggren. So you mentioned in your remarks the existence of a council for discussion between ministers and private sector and industry leaders. In your experience, does the industry see a business case for them to contribute to stockpiling and society resilience? Or is this more like a mindset and they're just willing to assist the government at their own cost? So if you could just explain a bit more the dynamics here with the private sector. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, look, I think to some extent it's a bit of both. There's both very much an engagement and a bit of altruism, and of course there's also a profit commercial motive. Now, there's a history here as always, and during the Cold War, I hate to use the word system again, but we had a system of companies that were deemed critical for wartime production, wartime critical companies. That system was disbanded. We're not going to do copy and paste, but we're looking at how can we recreate some kind of way to have companies contribute. And I think the Swedish private sector very much is motivated by an engagement that they form part, they understand that they form part of our civil defense, our total defense, but of course they also need to do their own continuity planning, and it's in their own interests to be ready to withstand war and to have done the planning that I mentioned, to look at what are the critical activities, what's their own supply chains. So I think it's a bit of both, to be honest.
So I have one question that I would want to ask, for the final question that I would want to ask General Giroux, and that again has to do with my German upbringing, which is that, General Reker talked about the change to threat-based planning, and obviously from a Czech perspective it's very clear where the threat is. Is France also moving to a threat-based planning, and is the enemy the same? And related to that, and I think that is one of those key questions that the Germans, I think, are asking themselves, is the French army also really now focusing more and more on the eastern flank?
It has always been a question for us, because I think that we are all determined by our geography and our history, obviously. Two things which are the key to understand countries. What is your history, what is your geography? The French geography, it's very easy. You see on the map, we are both an oceanic country and a continental country. So I'd say we are condemned, I'd say, to think in both ways. That is to say, focusing on a single flank is not the way we work. Probably there are some periods in time where we put more effort on one or the other flank, even if I think that you can't wrap up the international situation into only two flanks, especially in a time where we are working in multi-domain operations, and that today you can be attacked on your information systems by people who are thousands of kilometers from your point. And the fact that there are things such as space and cyber, the flanks are one of the subjects, but probably are not the sole one, and won't be the sole one in the future.
Thank you. So I think we had a very sobering, truth-finding panel from, statements such as we are, if we're really honest to ourselves, at least in Europe, not yet ready. And the question is, will we be ready, and when will we be ready, and against what will we be ready? Everyone stressed the need for resilience and to creating that societal will to fight, and probably some nations are further ahead than others, but there were also, I think, was also some room for optimism in terms of, viewing the glass half empty or half full, but also the significant opportunities for even increasing the interdependencies and the cooperation between the United States and its European allies. But I think particularly from a European perspective, I come away thinking that we have a lot of work to do still ahead of us, almost 3 years after the war began. But I want to take this opportunity to thank our excellent panelists, and please join me in thanking them.